It's time to talk NFL draft once again. This time, the Baltimore Ravens for 2022. The draft obviously over. We didn't get an opportunity to talk to Tony Lombardi before the draft, but now we get an opportunity, and this is better anyway. All that guessing, well, really, what does that do? But now we know exactly what's happening, Tony, and we have all of the profiles in the Our Lads guide right here. So, matter of fact, Tony, I must say this. As usual, the Baltimore Ravens they know how to conduct a draft. The history of the Ravens, they just sit there, they let all these players drop to them, and then they scoop them all up, best player available type deal. But I must say this: I have never seen a more talented group of college undrafted free signings in my life. I mean, the players that they signed after the draft are amazing. I mean, they had 10 guys that they signed. Probably, I'd say 6 of them that could have easily been drafted.
You know, there's a team of guys that when the draft is over, they call it round 8. And they had video of it on the Ravens website this year. And, you know, Eric DeCosta might be off doing one thing. The scouts are doing some other things. John Harbaugh's recruiting these guys and telling them why they have a great chance. And they go back to their undrafted free agent history, point out who's made it. I think they've got a string of maybe 15 or 16 seasons in a row where an undrafted free agent made it at least one. So they point to all these things. And I think that their relationships with agents and that track record speaks for itself, and it helps them recruit these guys.
And really, if you look at it, I mean, you would say, wow, the Ravens with what do they have? 11 picks?
Yes,
11 picks. And you got 11 picks. Normally, if a team has 11 picks, 5 of them are like 5th, 6th, 7th round. But the Ravens, 10 of the picks were in the first 4 rounds. So they had 10 round 4 talent players added to their roster. They have a bunch of guys they signed. So half of those guys are going to at least be on the practice squad, if not more, between the active roster and the practice squad. So was that the design, that we have to get more depth and youth on this team?
I think they're looking ahead to some players that will graduate to their second contracts, of course, Lamar Jackson being one of them. And they like to keep their guys. And they think that the best way to keep their guys is to have this influx of young talent to backfill, get some experience while they can allow some of these second contract guys graduate to other teams or keep them. And they try to keep these guys. And Eric DeCosta's style has been lately if they define a guy that they want to keep long term, they go to him before he gets to the end of his contract to extend him. Now, the exception to that is obviously Lamar Jackson, and there are different circumstances surrounding him. He's just a unique guy, doesn't have an agent. We can talk about that a little bit later, but I think the influx of young talent really allows the Ravens to do more things down the road with their salary cap and keep their star players.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's the rebuilding team that can say, yeah, we can keep all those guys. But perennial playoff teams like Baltimore, they don't. I don't think they envisioned themselves keeping all 11 draft picks, but 10 of them are 4th round draft pick. You don't get rid of those guys. So, do you see that there's a number of players that were on the roster last year, the depth guys, that either just weren't good enough, that they felt that they had to do a better job of replenishing that group, like you said, and every intent of adding maybe up to 12 fresh first-year players to their active roster?
Yeah, I think there's some guys in the defensive backfield that were around for a couple of 2 or 3 years, and they might not be around.
Okay.
I think there's a couple of offensive linemen that they've been able to get. A guy like Linderbaum, they got Lele, and they signed Morgan Moses. You've got some guys coming back, Ronnie Stanley coming back from injury. Put that all together, I think there's probably 2 or 3 expendable guys across the offensive front. And so I think that you'll see some of those young guys replace them. But I agree with you in a sense that 11 draft picks plus this undrafted free agent draft class, you put that together and you wonder how many are going to stick around. Because last year, Greg, I think they had 8 draft picks and only 6 of them stuck. So I really thought with having 6 4th round picks, Eric DeCosta may trade some of that draft capital in 2022 for draft capital in 2023, but that didn't happen.
Okay, so let's start. First of all, I'd rather go offense, defense. We'll start defense since Hamilton was the top pick. So, how surprising was it that Hamilton was available? Was this something that you guys talked about leading up into the draft? Your mock draft said, "Hey, if Hamilton slips," or was this like, "Wow"? I mean, how did we get a guy like this, in the position we were in?
One of the guys that does some draft work for us on Rush Street Report, I had a conversation with him, and he loved Kyle Hamilton. And I said, I actually think he's going to fall to the Ravens. He said, "You're out of your mind." He's like he's probably a top 5 player in the draft. And I said, I just think that with the undervalued position of safety and with the fact that he didn't have a very good combine, you couple those two things, it's what have he done for me lately a lot of times. And I think that impacted his draft status. And then they started, and the reason I said I thought he could fall to the Ravens, they had some teams before them at 14. They had some teams before them that I thought had other needs. But then I thought, well, if Kyle Hamilton does fall to them at 14, might they then trade that because they just went and signed Marcus Williams to be like a roaming safety on the back end?
Okay.
But I think they kind of envision now with their division, with Joe Burrow and with the receivers that the Bengals have, that it wouldn't be bad to have some long safeties that can cover a lot of ground. And if that was the mission accomplished.
Yeah, like you said, it is understandable when a guy runs whatever 4.59, whatever it was, that he's more likely not a top 10 draft pick. Okay, and that's fine. But like I said in the open, this is what the Ravens organization does. They're smart enough that because they draft usually where they do, worst case scenario is where they drafted this year, that they're going to end up in that situation where they just sit there and they let these players slip because teams are always going to draft early for quarterbacks. Usually you're going to get 3 or 4 players that are going to get drafted early that nobody expected. And the Ravens just sit back and go, "Oh, thank you." And then thank you. And Linderbaum, I have to say the Linderbaum pick made me sound like an idiot on one of my shows, because I talked about the athleticism, which is elite, and this is what makes Linderbaum such a great player. But that's not what the Ravens wanted. The Ravens, they're after power centers. That's what they want. So Linderbaum to Baltimore ain't going to happen. He's going to go to a team like the Eagles or somebody that needs an athletic center. So what happened there with Linderbaum? Because we know how good he is, but what happened with that kind of philosophy change? Were you surprised, or was this something that you had heard that was possible too? That, yeah, even though the Ravens don't normally draft athletic centers, he's the exception.
No, I did not hear anything about the Ravens doing anything like Linderbaum. I think that if they only had that 14th pick at 14, and let's say Kyle Hamilton's off the board, Eric DeCosta said we may have been in the pickle since the Eagles jumped up in front of them and picked Jordan Davis, because that was another guy that they liked.
Yep.
And fit in with the Ravens. But I think Linderbaum at 14 was probably something they weren't going to do. Maybe they trade back. We didn't know about the Marquise Brown trade that was upcoming. They did a credit to them. They kept that under lock, stock, and barrel. But because those, whether it was the agent, Marquise Brown, the Cardinals, and the Ravens, they did a nice job of keeping that off the books and not allowing people to come in and interrupt that trade at all. So, but Linderbaum to the Ravens, from a draft pick perspective, I thought 14 was way too high for him. At 25, I think that's value. But I also agree with you that he doesn't seem to fit the prototypical Ravens center. They go out and get 5th and 6th round centers who develop in probably year 3, like a Ryan Jensen, for example, sure. And then they go with that. But maybe there's just a changing the guard. I do know that they've got a great pipeline into Iowa because Kirk Ferentz has some part of his resume is with the Cleveland Browns / Ravens. So they've got a good pipeline into him, and they like taking Iowa offensive linemen because I think they think they're well coached. And I think that Tyler Linderbaum fits that bill. And I think that they also like the way he gets to the second level. He's always looking for somebody to hit downfield. And the way Lamar Jackson runs the offense, that's a big asset for the Ravens.
Speaking of the Marquise Brown trade, and you look at all these players that were drafted, and I don't see any wide receivers. I see a couple of wide receivers though that they signed, but nobody was brought in. So, what does that say about some of the younger players that are on the roster right now that we've talked about in the past, the Duvernay's, the Prochets, and so forth? What does that say about what the team has? Because a lot of people were thinking, even with Brown, that they were going to add maybe another wide receiver. So they just deleted Brown and didn't add. So what does that mean?
Well, Eric DeCosta is reluctant to give up receivers that they, particularly ones he drafted in the first round. And Marquise Brown happens to be the very first draft pick made by Eric DeCosta as a general manager. So he had some emotional attachment to Marquise, and they get along real well. He had off-season discussions with Marquise. He just wanted to get into an offense that was just going to, emphasize getting the ball downfield, utilizing his speed. He didn't think the Ravens were that kind of team, so he wanted to leave, and even leave behind one of his best friends in life, Lamar Jackson. But he's now going to another team that has another one of his best friends in life in Kyler Murray. But all that said, you're right. They didn't do anything except in the undrafted free agent world with the draft. They didn't make any picks for a wide receiver. They're basically saying we're going to give these young guys, Bateman and Devin Duvernay and James Prochet and Teelan Wallace. We're going to give these guys a chance. And if I go back to the pre-draft luncheon that they host every year, Eric DeCosta made a point of saying that we're going to have some players. They're going to be these veteran kind of players that come in after the fact in the summer, and they're going to make an impact this year. And so maybe they're trying to get these guys to earn these jobs. And if they do, great. If they don't, there's some veterans out there that they can take a chance on.
Anybody that is not currently on a team, obviously the biggest name is OBJ. So until he goes somewhere, anytime anybody talks about a big receiver, his name is going to pop up. But as far as all the, because there are a bunch of other veterans that are out there, is there anybody else that you think might fit the Raven style?
Fit the Ravens style, I think that Will Fuller would be a guy to fit their style, a guy who could stretch the defense. But the issue with him is that he's never healthy. And you could look at Julio Jones and say the very same thing. You could look at Deshaun Jackson and say the same thing there. And T.Y. Hilton, all these guys have question marks around them that, if healthy, they could help the Ravens. But the big question is, are they going to remain healthy? So I think what the Ravens are going to do is let these guys play it out, battle it out during the summer and during OTAs, see what happens there. And if there's some fallouts from other rosters, let's say there's an injury at safety, they've got an excess at safety now with Chuck Clark. Maybe they find a landing spot for him and they get a receiver in exchange for that. They're not going to get a top of the line receiver for Chuck Clark, but maybe they get that guy that can stretch the defense.
Okay, so McDonald comes back, and big surprise. This one had to be telegraphed a few months ago that David Ojabo would potentially land with the Ravens. So Ojabo lands with the Ravens, and by the way, so does another linebacker with Michigan, Josh Ross, one of the free agent signings. Who led the team with 106 tackles last year. Ross, I'm not sure he makes the team. He's probably more of a definite, in my mind, practice squad guy. But as far as Ojabo, it's all about the injury, and what a bargain to be able to get a player of that caliber in round 2.
Yeah, I think he represented value in round 2. He's a guy that before the injury, some draft picks decided or pegged him to the Ravens at 14. So they end up getting 3 guys, that one of which was not pegged to drop to 14, but 2 other guys, Linderbaum and Ojabo, that people were saying that they could fall to 14 and the Ravens might pick them. But all that said, I think you get value for a guy. Maybe he's a red shirt this year. He seems to think he's going to get back on the field sometime in November. And if that happens, that'll be great. But I think they'll bring him along slowly. They've had history with Achilles injuries. They had Steve Smith Sr., who was a little long on the tooth when he had it. He came back fairly quickly. And they had Terrell Suggs, who suffered a late spring Achilles tear playing basketball out in Arizona. He ended up playing for the team during the Super Bowl year and got back in November and helped them win the title in 2012. So they've had a history with it. Even Eric DeCosta tore his Achilles playing racquetball in the facility and said, look, you're a lot better athlete than I am, David. So I think you could bounce back in 4 months just like I did.
Yeah, well, the future, I'm sure they're just hoping, because that's what this team really does need. They need an Ojabo Awe future edge rush tandem
Absolutely.
because that's been lacking for a little bit. And that's, I think,
Like,
really part of the problem that really hasn't gotten this defense over the hump lately.
I agree. And they've had some guys that haven't been able to stay healthy. Tyus Bowser had a breaking out year last year. He tore his Achilles as well. So he is in the building working out, and he's hopeful to get on the field when they start the season as well. But if the Ojabo can come back in November, Dalen Hayes out of Notre Dame last year looked really good in training camp and looked like he could bring a presence off the edge, but he got hurt as well. So it was a bad injury season for the Ravens in 2021. And if they can just be healthy, it's almost like they got a bunch of guys back, or they recruited and hired a bunch of new guys, even though these guys were with the team, just couldn't play last year.
Okay, so after that, again, the team is able to land Travis Jones in round 3. And here's a player that up until the last few days of the draft, people were wondering, hey, could Travis Jones be like a late first-round draft pick? Because that's how much steam that he was gaining with the talent. And then I think it happens. I mean, if you played for Alabama, you'd probably been talked about a lot sooner. But when you play for one of the worst college football programs known to man over the last couple of years in Division I football, you get lost in the shuffle a little bit. So, but wow, being able to once again, let's just let him move into our lap in round 3 and pick up a guy. Because you said a lot of people thought Baltimore was going to be picking up a defensive tackle with their first pick, but they needed
Right.
to fill that spot, and they get one in the 3rd round.
The Ravens had him ranked just behind Jordan Davis at defensive tackle. They like the way he can be slippery inside the guard and center, and I think that they like the fact that he's a guy that took a lot of snaps, probably limited his productivity because he was gassed. He was like out on the field 73% of the defensive snaps for Connecticut. And when you look at the Ravens rotation, they're thinking of managing him in that 25 to 30% range, which would make him a more productive interior pass rusher. And if he is, that helps guys like Calais Campbell get home and their edge guys get home. So I think there's different ways to create pass rush, and then the interior of the inside the tackles is one way to do that. And the Ravens think that they're accomplishing that with the acquisition of Travis
Yeah,
Jones.
because that was the one thing that I noticed doing research on the draft and how the Ravens looked on paper on the depth chart, that they looked like, especially up front, they needed to get younger because they got a
Yes,
lot of veterans up front on defense.
they do, and I think with guys like Travis Jones, and you've got Madubuike, he'll be going into his 3rd season. He showed some promise last year. You got Broderick Thomas, not Thomas, Broderick Washington. He's a guy that started to come on late last year. When you have those guys, throw in some of the veterans like Brent Urban, who they just signed. Derek Wolfe, we don't know what the future of his future is going to be like in Baltimore. He may not be around, but if he is, had a good season for the Ravens. And then Calais Campbell, the Ravens believe that with fewer snaps, he'll be more productive. Won't have to be as gassed and be more productive later in the season than he was last year.
All right, so in the 4th round, the first of 6 4th-round draft picks, to get the, what is this guy, like 6'8", 6'9", Daniel Falele out of Minnesota. He had a 2nd-round grade. Once again, slipped to us in the 4th round. They must have been pretty happy to get a player like that in round 4, because I'm assuming he's the guy that will eventually replace Morgan Moses when it's time.
Correct. And that allows them to bring him along a little bit. He didn't play against a lot of big time competition, but at the same time, he's got really, really good feet for a guy who's 6'8" and 380 pounds. And he's actually well proportioned. So the Ravens could, really work with him. Morgan Moses signed a very economical 3-year, $15 million deal. The way those things are typically structured, they could easily get out of that in 2 years. So I think Falele is a guy that could assume that right tackle position in 2023 or 2024.
Okay, and then as far as the DBs, there were 2 in the draft, and they both were obviously in the 4th round. Armour Davis out of Alabama was the first one, and Demarion Williams from Houston was the last one of the 4th round. So what does the team like about both of those guys?
Well, they like Armour Davis's ability to cover. He's got a nice little back pedal, seems to shadow receivers pretty well. He can play inside or outside. He's got good pedigree. The biggest question mark with him is his health, and that's pretty much why he slipped to the fourth round. Otherwise, he had second round grades when healthy. But this is a kid that if he stays healthy, he's a really nice player to have in the mix. But he's also a guy that if you have 6 fourth round picks, it's okay to take a gamble on one. And I think that he represents a gamble because what I was told is that Armour Davis was not even on some teams' draft boards because of medical issues.
Okay. And then the other kid from Houston, who actually Arledge had as a 6th round grade, but the Ravens liked him enough to draft him in round 4. What do they like about Devin Williams?
He's a scrappy guy, can play slot. They were Tavon Young moved on. They didn't really care with how he played last year. He's been very injured, but they want that scrappy, feisty guy who's willing to do those battles in the slot and going across the middle to defend receivers like that, the smaller receivers. So they think that he fits that bill. He may be one of those guys that ends up with a little hangnail and then ends up on IR for his developmental purposes.
Okay.
But I think that we'll see whether he makes the team or not. But they like his competitiveness, and he just never wants to back down. And that's what they say is playing like a Raven.
Okay. And then 2 tight ends were added in round 4. Charlie Kohler from Iowa State and Isaiah Likely from Coastal Carolina. And just, watching Kohler play over the last few years, he just seems to be a nice, reliable target for Purdy in that offense, the Campbell offense. And Likely, I think, was more about like a size issue. Like, was he mismatching based on competition, and how exactly will the NFL team want to use him at the next level? So to get both guys, I mean, that makes a lot of sense as well, because you have a much better chance for at least one of them sticking out.
Yeah, Kohler is a guy who reminds them a little bit of Dennis Pitta. He's bigger than Dennis Pitta, but he's real angular like Pitta was, and a guy who's a real heady player, really reads the defenses, knows where to sit down in zones, knows how to get open, and so they like him for that. They'll probably have to develop him as a blocker. In terms of Likely, you're right. He is a mismatch guy. He's a guy that isn't your prototypical tight end. He's not a receiver. He's a tweener. Yeah. But the way the Ravens have used guys, like they actually use that to create mismatches. And I think what you'll see him do is run a little H-back, run a little, run out of the slot. And I think you'll see the Ravens in 13 formation a lot because they have all these tight ends. They got Nick Boyle, and of course they've got Mark Andrews, the All-Pro.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense for a team that values that position so much with that offense, with that quarterback and Mark Andrews, to make sure that you have a couple more talented young players on the roster just in case. So that made a lot of sense. And then go ahead.
You were saying earlier, Greg, is the Ravens just waited for the best player available to fall to them. They weren't going to reach. They were going to stay true to their board. And, most people would say, and you said it earlier in the program, that they needed a wide receiver. Well, Likely ahead of a lot of the wide receivers they had on their board, so they picked him.
That's it. There you go. No reason to reach for a 6th or 7th round graded wide receiver when you can draft a tight end like Likely in the 4th round. Okay, and then the last player in the 4th round to talk about was the punter, the second rated punter prospect for our lads in this draft, Jordan Stout, who actually had a 5th round grade. So it wasn't like this was a big surprise that he was drafted. But when you draft a punter in the 4th round, he's supposed to punt week 1.
Yeah. And he's replacing Sam Cook, who was with the team for 16 seasons. Sam was, I believe, a 6th round pick in 2006. And Sam was one of the most likable guys, just a complete professional, loved within the organization. And he wanted to actually play another year. And he had one more year left on his contract. But the Ravens, this is the kind of organization they are. They went to Sam before they made this pick, told them what they were thinking about. He didn't want to take a pay cut. He wanted just to keep playing. And then as it got close to the draft, the Ravens made the pick with full disclosure. They came to him, and now they made him a coach. So he's staying in the organization. He officially announced his retirement, and he's now a coach in the organization. And I saw on the Ravens website there were some pictures of him with Jordan Stout already coaching him up. So it's a nice situation for the Ravens. And Jordan Stout does one more thing that I think maybe falls under the radar a little bit. He's a pretty decent place kicker and kicks the ball a ton off the tee, on kickoffs. The Ravens believe that later in the year, that can help preserve Justin Tucker, so that maybe those kicks that he hits in October, those lengthy kicks, he doesn't hit them in December because there's some wear and tear on that leg for the
Okay.
season. They believe that having Stout kick off at times will help Justin Tucker later in the season when it counts the most.
Okay, and then it's interesting. We talked about how many of those fourth rounders and overall the 10 players drafted up until round 4, and most of those guys you want to play and find roster spots. So the one guy that's not in that round 4 discussion or top 4 was Tyler Batty, the running back in round 6, and yet I still think that Batty is just too talented of a player not to make the roster. I just was surprised that he actually lasted until round 6 myself. I understand why he's not the biggest player, et cetera, but he's just, I don't care about size, and you shouldn't care about size when you have a lot of the other intangibles going your way. And he's somebody that produced at the highest level in the SEC. And I think that he can do, especially with a team that values the running back position so much, and as their top 2 guys that are still rehabbing from injury.
Yeah, and that's a great point because in the grand scheme of things, when all guys are healthy, all things being equal, that Batty is a guy who probably doesn't see a lot of time unless he contributes on special teams. And that's really important, near and dear to the Ravens' heart because their head coach is a guy steeped in special teams. But I think Batty is a guy, his style fits the Ravens. And I think he's also a pretty good receiver out of the backfield, and I think that will help the Ravens as well because they really haven't had a lot of that. But if Jones is healthy and Gus Edwards are healthy, he won't see a lot of time. But I think the Ravens didn't want to be in a position that they were in last year, where those 2 guys went down and they were scouring all over the scrap heap of running backs. They brought in Latavius Murray, they brought in Devontae Freeman, they brought in Le'Veon Bell, and none of those guys really clicked. Although Freeman did a decent job. I just think that they wanted to avoid that situation. They went out and got Batty. They've still got Justice Hill on the roster, and then they added Mike Davis, a guy that played for Carolina and Atlanta, who's a tank of a runner, and his style fits the Ravens. So they just didn't want to be in that situation again, and they didn't want to have to force J.K. Dobbins or Gus Edwards into action if they weren't quite ready.
Okay, and as now it's time to talk about some of those undrafted free agents that were signed. First of all, look, signing Anthony Brown, well, that makes a lot of sense based on the type of player and type of quarterback he was in college. And if Tyler Huntley could have, even though Tyler Huntley to me was a better college quarterback than Anthony Brown, so I don't think Anthony Brown is going to make the roster, but he's an interesting practice squad kid based on the system. And it makes sense that they had a guy like that.
Yeah, I agree that the athleticism is there, and the fact that he's a guy who, like, he just fits that style of play. You look at Tyler Huntley, you look at Lamar Jackson, and you look at him, and then you wonder, is this a guy that they could bring along in the practice squad? That's kind of the path that Tyler Huntley took, and Tyler Huntley, when forced into action, despite all those injuries, did a pretty last year. So I think with the Ravens, he's in the right spot, and I think he'll see that at some point he might get a shot to be that backup with the Baltimore Ravens, who run an offense just that's tailored to his skill set.
Also on offense, Ricky Person Jr. has had some injury concerns over his career, but he's a big guy, 6'1", 222 out of NC State. And then the wide receivers, Devin Williams, 6'5", 207. The big deal there is that he's ran a slow 40 time, but he's got the size and played it in a Pac-12 with a big time team in Oregon. And then you got the kid Polk from Mississippi State, who had a 4th round grade and wasn't drafted, had over 1,000 yards receiving and 105 receptions last year, but again had a disappointing 40 time. Bolden from Alabama. A lot of, I know my Patriot analysts thought Bolden was the perfect fit for the way the Patriots like to have their schemes for these types of wide receivers. So we'll see how Bolden may fit with the Ravens. And my favorite is Emeka Emezi, because of, I know he's not very fast, but he's 6'3", 220. He's like really compact, built like almost like a tight end. I mean, he's just a big guy. Not fast, but he's just productive, and he makes a lot of big catches and has made a lot of big catches in big games for NC State over the last few years. So there's a lot of talent there at wide receiver to battle it out, to maybe even, especially with the fact that there's a lot of young guys on this wide receiver roster. I could see one or two of these guys maybe fighting for a roster spot.
Yeah, other than Bolden, you got a bunch of guys who are lengthy, maybe make those contested catches, maybe they're red zone targets, and the Ravens are really trying to round out their wide receiver core. There's the definite opening for a fifth and sixth wide receiver on this team, so the opportunity is there. But I think what they want, they've got a guy in Rashad Bateman who is the most well-rounded receiver I think they've ever drafted. And then they've got a guy in Devin Duvernay who has potential after the catch. He's fast. The other two guys in Teelan Wallace and James Prochet, sort of like slot guys, real good hands. And so you want a guy that has a little length and could be that guy to make those contested catches, because they don't have that 6'3", 6'4" guy. So they brought in a few guys that fit that bill, and they'll be able to battle it out to see what happens this summer and see if they can make the team.
Okay, and then on defense, I mentioned Ross was somebody to throw in there. Jeremiah Moon, another linebacker with a 6th-round grade. Jacoby McLean. I like McLean. There's something about him. I like his style. I think he fits perfectly with the Ravens style. He had a 5th-round grade, as I mentioned, led Auburn in tackling the last 2 years. I think he's going to find a way to make this team. And also Diego Fago out of Navy. I thought he was going to get drafted at some point, but there were so many interior linebackers in this year's draft that it was just too deep. You just knew some guys were going to get lost in the shuffle, and I guess he was one of them. But I just think he's too talented. I know maybe he makes the practice squad, but I think he's gonna find a way on this roster at some point this year.
Well, they'd like to be able to keep them all, Craig, but we know that they can't.
I know.
I think the more good players you bring in, the greater your competition is, and the better competition, the more guys are going to study, the more they're going to do the small details, take care of the small details in their jobs to make them that little bit better of a player and take that next step as professionals. So the more competition, the better. And the Ravens have done a great job this offseason in bringing in the competition.
Any players that we should be keeping an eye on that were maybe in this spot last year as far as rookie free agents or guys that were middle to late round draft picks who you think not that many people outside of Baltimore know who these guys are, but they looked really good maybe in the practice squad and limited playing time, and maybe this is going to be their year to step up?
Well, I do think that we already talked about him briefly. James Prochet is a guy he had like some opportunity last year, and when he was given the opportunity, I think he had one game against the Bengals, maybe had 7 catches for 78 yards. I think he's a guy that if given the opportunity, he can make some noise. He's a shifty guy, knows how to create separation, despite the fact that he's not much of a burner. And if you're looking for a guy who has proven productivity at SMU, I think he had like over 200 catches his junior and senior year. So he's a proven guy. I think he's a guy that could probably take that next step and be something in the NFL.
Any chance that the Ravens sign any veterans? We talked about wide receiver being one of them. Is their salary cap okay? Can they sign a player or two? But I mean, we just talked about this roster being so deep of young talent. I can't imagine that there's going to be much out there for them to pick up, and again, based on their salary cap as well.
I think what you'll see is another receiver come in eventually. I think you'll see an edge rusher come back. I would not be surprised. Actually, I'd be more surprised if he did not come back, and that is Justin Houston. The Ravens did something that was unusual. They put an unrestricted free agent tender, or gave him an unrestricted free agent tender, which means that they have the right to match what he's offered elsewhere, or they have to give him a 10% raise over last year. Well, last year's was such a bargain. I think he just had a little over $2.2 million that he'd get a 10% raise over that. So they get him for roughly $2.4 million. Not that he's in the prime of his career, but he did a pretty decent job last year. And for the money, he'd be a nice bargain for them to have. He's a real good veteran, a guy who's great in the locker room, and a guy who could take guys like Oweh and Ojabo under his wing and make them better players.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. And we will look forward to talking to you again sometime around the preseason training camp. I can't wait for when that happens. It's going to be a long summer, waiting for the football season to begin again.
Right.
But I'm sure this is going to be a fun summer for Ravens fans because of all the youth that we talked about. There's tons of youth. Have you remembered a time when there was this much youth coming into training camp, competing for roster spots for the Ravens?
No, and when you take the youth from 2022, combine it with what they did in the draft in 2020 and 2021, there's a lot to be excited about. If these players take that next step as professionals, combined with the group they're bringing in 2022, it is a lot to be excited about for the Ravens.
Shows, you doing any weekly shows right now, Tony?
We do a show in season called the Front Office, and we've done some stuff in the off season with Front Office that you can find wherever you get your podcast. And Brian McFarland, our salary cap guy, and I sit down and we bring in some guests, some beat writers. We'll probably have Eric DaCosta on just prior to the season opening up and things like that. Then I do this thing called Word on the Street, which is just usually a 3 or 4 minute, kind of like a sports minute, but a little bit extended, where we talk about a couple of different topics, try to get things stirred up, and give our fans just something to listen to and talk about.
Great job, Tony. It was good to finally get an opportunity to talk to you. And nobody knows what we're talking about, but that's okay. And we will look forward to talking to you again. I can't wait when the preseason comes, Tony.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I'm not one to want to wish my summer away, but at the same time, I'm looking forward to the 2022 season because for Ravens fans, the 2021 season left a really bad taste in our collective mouth. And they went to 8-3, looked like they were the number 1 seed at one point in time, and just everything fell apart due to those injuries. And it just is something that the Ravens fans are looking for the team to get back on the field. And I think it's going to be an exciting season for them.
Yeah, we're going to talk all about that, Lamar Jackson, everything. So that's for the preseason show because, yeah, that was one of the things that we were talking about on our shows last year where we were going, I was saying, I can't believe how lucky Baltimore is. I know there's a line between luck and coaching and talent, but it just seemed like they were just finding these ways to win these games, these unbelievable ways. And it was like you said, eventually it just caught up to them with all the injuries. So,
right.
But there was a time there where I was going, this is the team of destiny. I mean, I just can't believe how they're winning. I can't believe how they won that game. I can't believe how they won that game.
It felt like that. You watched them play the Detroit Lions. They looked horrible, and Justin Tucker hits a 66-yard field goal. Those things just aren't normal.
Yeah.
But then again, neither are the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah. And then they had the Colt game, which was crazy.
Right.
And there was another game, too. They're all over the place. That's how many. Well, we'll talk about that when we talk about the preseason.
Game.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah. So it's and then that's what shows you. People don't realize until the two teams that get to the Super Bowl, and then you take a look at their injury reports, and it's like, a guy here and a guy there. That's what it takes. It's a combination of a lot of factors, but one of the major factors is you cannot have a large injury report. And sometimes it happens, and it happens to the best teams as well.
Yeah, and with the Rams, they stayed healthy, and then they added pieces along the way that helped them, the strategic pieces. So not a bad blueprint to follow.
No, and teams are trying to do that. We know how the NFL is, but it's not easy. Okay. Tony, appreciate it. We'll talk to you in a few months.
My pleasure. Thanks, Greg.